So of course we know that most people, before major depression happens, there's this super traumatic, stressful event that takes place and triggers their major depressive episode. So some people get through it, but there's some people um, who don't manage to come out the other side. The people who do come out the other side, they're no more at risk for depression than anybody else. You know, they deal with their psychological issue. So a second stressful event happens and you fall into a depression. You come out the other end, no more at risk than anyone else for depression. But somewhere around the fourth or fifth stressful event, something happens different in the brain. Things start to just sort of cycle on their own. You no longer need a major stressor to cause you to get depressed. And so it just sort of, there's this transition where things are running on their own. So major stress predisposes you towards depression, but now it doesn't actually take a major stressor to cause you to go into a major depressive episode. So the interesting thing is if we look at other diseases like Cushing's disease, where people have, not naturally, but there's something wrong with their body where it produces high levels of cortisol, of these glucocorticoids, without being under stress. Or people are treated with cortisol, with hydrocortisone, steroids, for extended periods of time, they're actually much more likely to get depressed. So it seems to be the glucocorticoids, the cortisol, that's causing people to somehow be predisposed towards depression. What happens is your brain is getting depleted of dopamine. That's the neurochemistry of how you got to this point. So we've got something about the brain chemistry in depression, something about the structure of the brain, something about hormones. They're all working together to form this depression. You've got dopamine depletion, serotonin depletion, norepinephrine depletion, major stressors affecting your body. And so as a therapist, psychologist, nurse, doctor, you treat based on the typical standards. You give antidepressants and so on. The vast majority of people are given antidepressants. But this actually only treats about 30 to 40% of the people with depression. So let's talk a bit about the psychology of depression, because of course this is a psychology class. So of course we have to talk about Sigmund Freud, because he is actually very relevant to depression. So Freud dealt with this puzzle of depression and the difference between who gets depressed and gets through it and who doesn't. The turn of the century Viennese term for people who come out the other side was mourning. So you mourn and you recover. Their term for major depression was melancholia. So Freud had this famous essay where he asked, what's the difference between mourning and melancholia? Why do some people only mourn and some people get through it? And he came up with this great model. According to Freud, you have mixed feelings. You have ambivalence about everybody you love. You love them, but you also hate them. You resent them, but you want them to be there. So in Freud's view, you loved somebody. You've just loved a lost one. And when that happens, most people are able to focus on the love and the sense of loss. You mourn, you come out the other end, you're good to go. But with melancholia, Freud said that there's a subset of people who they can't put those negative feelings in the background. They can't focus on the love of the people. So instead, they're just filled with love and hate and regret and pain and happiness. And so they're just sort of wallowing in this melancholic loss and the ambivalence about the loved one. And they can't let go of the pain, or it's sort of like a lot of people deal with this when an elderly parent dies. They feel, of course they're upset, but then they also feel totally relieved and happy and like a burden's gone, and they feel horribly guilty for it. And that's what Freud believed caused this melancholia. And this was sort of the psychological beginnings of explaining depression. And no wonder you have grief if you lose somebody, and it's bad enough that you've lost the loved person, but then you lose them and you've lost the opportunity to ever make things better with them, and you have these feelings of guilt, and you're so conflicted, and it totally makes sense about why you would have horrible depression after the loss of this person. And it's not just death that this happens in, but it could be all sorts of things. You were raped or molested, and you feel responsible for it happening, although at the same time you feel victimized. You also have mixed feelings between victimization, like helplessness, versus I could have done something. I could have told somebody and I didn't do it. And so am I responsible because I didn't tell anybody? Or, so you have all these conflicting emotions, and that conflict is much more likely to lead to depression, just like Freud's model of depression. So one of the interesting things that came out of Freud's theory is this quote that depression is aggression turned inwards. Depression is aggression turned inwards. Because you've got nobody else out there to have these arguments with, nobody else to blame. The person that you've most loved, most hated, and you've never been able to hash it out with them, and now they're gone. And there's no way to do it. You've lost the opportunity forever. And all you can do is internalize all of that aggression at yourself. Instead of being mad at that person, now who do you have to be mad at? You can't go yell at them. You've lost them. And so you turn that inward. So of course, no wonder you're going to be depressed. No wonder you're secreting stress hormones. No wonder you can't get out of bed. No wonder you have no energy. Of course, that leaves us with the question of how does this connect to our neurochemistry and our hormones? What does estrogen and progesterone ratios have to do with love-hate ratios? It sounds really interesting, but you can't really do modern science on it, and that's the biggest problem with Freud, is you can't really research it. So instead, we can look at experimental psychology and try to understand what's the psychology of stress. What is it that makes psychological stressors stressful? There's an enormous amount of literature on this showing that for the same external misery, you feel more stressed. You turn on more of a stress response. You're more at risk for stress-related disease. So there's a direct correlation with, and like I said, enormous amounts of research saying that when you feel stressed out, it causes physiological diseases. There is a connection. If you don't have outlets for frustration caused by the stressor, if you feel like you don't have any control for what's happening, you have no predictability when bad things are occurring, you don't have social support, a shoulder to cry on, this is what psychological stress is about. And what depression is these pathological extremes of this. You fall into this cognitive psychology sort of idea of learned helplessness, where you can't get out of the situation. Something bad happens to you. They did this experiment with German Shepherds where they put them in a room with shocks, and there was no escape for the dog to get out, and eventually the dog just lay down and took it. Which, of course, that psychomotor retardation we see with depression. So you have this enormous stress that you can't get rid of, and one of the ways your body copes with it is just shut down. Just don't do anything. So learned helplessness is a physiological, normal reaction to a stressful situation. So with depression, with learned helplessness, you're basically saying, this is the situation, and this is the whole world. There's nothing else outside of this box that I'm getting shocked in. You're the German Shepherd. In depression, you're the German Shepherd being shocked and saying, there's nothing more to this world than this. And you decide that this situation is indeed the entire world. There's no escape from it. I might as well give up. I have no control. I'm always helpless. I'm always hopeless. This is the psychology of what depression is about. At that point, you don't have a whole lot of trouble seeing how you wind up in here. So stress affects on some dopamine, all that neurotransmitter stuff. So anyhow, we've got these two extreme different viewpoints about what depression is about. We have the sort of biological, physiological stuff. We have the psychological stuff, which is two totally different things. Loss, lack of hope, lack of control. One version of it, one of the most reliable findings in the whole epidemiology of depression is you lose a parent to death when you're under 10 years of age, and for the rest of your life, you are more at risk for a major depression. This makes perfect sense because what's going on in the first 10 years of your life? You're learning about cause and effect. You're learning, is there a world out there that I have some sort of control over? And you've just learned in the most awful way that you have no control over life. And sometimes the world is awful, and there's all sorts of reasons to be helpless and to give up in the world. And you're that much closer to the edge of this learned helplessness cliff. For the rest of your life, you have an extremely powerful model of depression. So you have these two conflicting ideas. You have, on one sense, you have this sort of biological, physiological thing going on where, you have neurotransmitters and neuroanatomy, the structure of the brain and brain chemistry and hormones and estrogen and estrogen progesterone ratios and thyroid hormone and epinephrine and norepinephrine. And on the other hand, you have Freudian melancholia and mourning, and you have these psychological concepts of coping mechanisms and lack of control, and sociological, women in certain situations of, of course, lacking control again, and, all of these psychological factors. So how are they affecting each other? What is the connection between the two? And the link is, of course, stress. Stress is the intersection of two very interesting domains. So depression is genetic. It tends to run in families. The more closely related you are, if one person has depression, then it increases the likelihood that the other person will have depression. Identical twins, if one twin is depressed, the other one has a 50% chance of being depressed. Full siblings have a 25% chance. Half siblings have an 8% chance. And if you have depression, then just a random person off the street has a 2% chance of also having depression. So obviously genetics is playing a huge role in this system. So what does this tell you? It tells you that, of course, depression is genetic. But what it also tells you is that if you have a 50% chance of having depression, if your identical twin has depression, then you also have a 50% chance of not having depression, which means that genetics is not the whole picture. Genetics is only half of the picture. Genes and depression are not about inevitability, it's about vulnerability. So your genetics is a foundation that makes you predisposed to depression. If depression runs in your family, it is in your genetics, but it does not guarantee that you will become depressed. So for instance, if you're Irish, depression runs in Irish lines. The Irish are famous for their depression. But that doesn't mean that you won't be happy. It simply means that you are more predisposed to it. You have a higher likelihood. So if other environmental factors come in, it could more easily push you over the edge into depression than somebody who is less predisposed to it genetically. So the really interesting thing about this genetic link is that researchers have found a certain gene that is very strongly associated with depression. And this has been really strongly supported by research. It's been replicated in numerous studies. This gene was found to be very clearly related to serotonin, and particularly to that recycling part of the neurotransmitter. So remember, there is a pump that sucks neurotransmitters back up so that it can be recycled and reused. And this gene has been found to be linked to the ability of your neurons to recycle serotonin. So what researchers found, and there was this amazing study that was done that is going to probably be one of the most important papers of the beginning of this century. And what this paper found is that there's two genes that are associated with serotonin reuptake. One is a good version of the gene and the other is the bad version. Now, logically, you would think that if you had the bad gene, then you're going to be doomed for depression. But remember, genetics only predispose you to something. They don't necessarily guarantee that you're going to have that something. So in this study, it was done in New Zealand, and they looked at 17,000 children. And they followed these children year after year after year until they were adults in their 20s. And they looked to see, did the children with the bad gene grow up to have depression? And did the children with the good gene grow up to not have depression? And the answer is that no. If you had the bad gene, it did not predict whether you were going to have depression. What made the difference was if there was a history of stress. So divorce, physical abuse, death of a family member, some sort of major trauma in life. So if you looked at the people that had the good gene, if one of these major stressors happened in their early development, the risk of depression, of course, increased. Unsurprisingly, it increased. But if you looked at the people with the bad gene, the risk of depression skyrocketed if some traumatic stressor happened in early development. If there was no stressor, then the rates of depression were basically the same. But if there was a stressor, then the good genetic people went up, but the bad genetic people went way up. So it's not about genes that control our brains, genes that control our behavior. This is a gene that's relevant to how readily we pick ourselves up after life has dumped on our heads. So it's more like a rebound gene. Like how well can you cope with stress and deal with stress? And how well can you bounce back from it? And if you had the bad gene, what it was saying is that you can't bounce back from these stressors. People with the good genetics bounce back much better than people with the bad genetics. Now here's where it really becomes interesting. The ending of this story is that glucocorticoids, that cortisol, those stress hormones control and regulate this coping gene. Now we see the connection of neurotransmitters and chemicals and hormones and stress and psychology and genetics. All of these various pieces, they're all being controlled and regulated together by the amount of stressors in your life, how you cope with it, and so on. It's all working together, and it's an amazing piece of machinery how the body is working. And suddenly you have a whole new way of looking at this world of psychological components of stress and merging it with biochemistry and in an integrated model. So what I want you to most take away from this is that this psychological thing, the stress that we're dealing with, the stuff that's going on in our head, this is not just, oh, get over it. This is a real thing. This is real biology, real physiology. This is genetics and neurochemistry and neuroanatomy and childhood vulnerabilities and glucocorticoid regulation of genetic expression. I mean, this is a real thing. This is as real as diabetes or cancer, and you wouldn't tell somebody with cancer to just get over it and be in a better mood. You would feel for them, and you would look at it as a real disease. Depression is a real disease. And so you have to look at people differently. We have such a negative attitude towards depression, like it isn't a real issue, when it is completely a real biological disease. And you guys are college students, which means you've got these high achiever, type A personality people who are working themselves into the ground, stressing yourselves out. You've got high cortisol, high glucocorticoid levels, which is affecting your gene expression. If you have the good gene, then you're going to come through this all right, most likely. You have a slightly higher chance of depression, but not huge. If you've got the bad gene, then you're in a situation where you have a high likelihood of having depression. A lot of college students are depressed, and one of the reasons is because you're so stressed out, and stress is causing this entire cascade of biological, neurochemical, genetic, regulatory issues, and it's a real thing. We shouldn't ignore depression and act like this is something to be ashamed of or embarrassed of. Like, you wouldn't be embarrassed that you had diabetes or cancer. You shouldn't be embarrassed that you have depression either. So, okay. Anyhow, that's my rant. I hope that you found this interesting. I found this idea of the connection between stress and genetics and neurochemistry really fascinating. It's more than just all in your head. So I hope those words never come out of your mouth if you're working in therapy or the medical industry. Stress is physiological, depression is physiological, psychology is physiological. It is all interconnected in the body. All right, see you guys next lecture.